Farming. It's more than a job. It's a way of life for millions of people. But hundreds of thousands of farmers and ranchers who have worked the land for generations are losing their farms to foreclosure and bankruptcy. Recent financial surveys show that between 15 and 30% of our most efficient producers will be wiped out in the next 12 to 24 months. Black and other minority farmers face total elimination if conditions do not improve. If this trend continues, huge super farms owned by corporations and investors will totally displace our family farmers and ranchers, and the results will be devastating. This is not the first time farmers have been threatened with extinction. For almost a decade before the stock market crash of 1929, rural America suffered a terrible economic depression, which then grew to engulf urban America as well. Squeezed between low prices and high costs, farmers organized to end corporate manipulation of agriculture. They formed coalitions with rural banks, businesses, and labor. Together, they lobbied Congress for legislation to protect their communities. It took almost a decade to win national farm legislation. This legislation, called the PARITY Farm Program, had three important features. First, the Commodity Credit Corporation was created to make loans to farmers whenever prices fell below the cost of production. This allowed farmers to hold their crops off the market, creating a floor under prices. By allowing farmers to control their marketing, the CCC loan program made it possible for them to receive a fair price from the marketplace, without subsidies. Second, farm production was market-oriented, controlled to balance supply with demand. Since government storage of surpluses was enormously expensive, this feature was crucial to reducing government costs. Third, a national grain reserve was created to prevent consumer prices from skyrocketing in times of drought or other natural disasters. When prices rose above a predetermined level, grain was released from government stocks onto the market, driving prices back down to normal levels. During the 20 years this parity legislation was in effect, farmers received fair prices for their crops. Production was controlled to prevent costly surpluses, and consumer prices remained low and stable. Farmers reestablished soil and water conservation practices they were forced to abandon during the Depression. Most important, this parity farm program was not a burden to the taxpayers. The CCC, by charging interest on its storable commodity loans, made nearly $13 million between 1933 and 1952. Not everyone supported these programs. For example, grain companies wanted low grain prices in hopes of increasing profits. Chemical companies opposed supply management. They believed that fewer acres planted meant reduced sales of pesticides and fertilizer. Dozens of think tanks were funded by these corporations to lobby Congress for lower farm prices. One of these groups, the Committee for Economic Development, published this report, An Adaptive Program for Agriculture. Then, as now, there were only two possible directions for farm policy. Quoting directly from this CED report, the choices before us are A, leak-proof control of farm production, or B, a program such as we are recommending here to induce excess resources, people primarily, to move rapidly out of agriculture. The program would involve moving off the farm about 2 million of the present farm labor force. To accomplish this forced removal, they recommended that the price supports for wheat, cotton, rice, feed grains, and related crops now under price supports be reduced immediately. This graph shows the effects of the success of the corporate planners in repealing the parity farm legislation in 1953. With the exception of 1972, a year of unusual shortages, prices have fallen steadily ever since. By the early 1970s, Congress was forced to respond to the crisis it had created. Instead of challenging the corporate interests by restoring the successful parity programs, it chose to initiate an entirely new plan called the Deficiency Payment Target Price Program. It has been the most destructive and expensive farm program in U.S. history. Let's look at how this program works. The cost of production of corn for many farmers will be around $3.25 per bushel. Congress, in response to pressure from the large grain exporters, has set the market price at roughly $2. $1 of the loss suffered by farmers is absorbed by taxpayers through deficiency payment subsidies tied to target prices. The remaining 25 cents is a loss to farmers. The 1987 wheat program provides another example. Average cost of production will be $4.80 per bushel. The market price is set by Congress at $2.40. $1.98 of the loss is made up through deficiency payment subsidies. The other 42 cents is a loss to farmers. The target price concept is not only a disaster for farmers and taxpayers, it has been devastating to the environment. By tying subsidies to the number of bushels produced, it has forced hard-pressed farmers to increase production, sometimes plowing up hillsides in fragile grasslands, or pouring on more and more fertilizer. Caught between rigged low prices and skyrocketing costs, farmers borrowed against their land in order to survive. U.S. farm debt is now larger than the combined foreign debt of Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. In 1981, land prices began to fall. Farmers could no longer borrow against their land to cover losses. This signaled the beginning of the end for hundreds of thousands of family farmers and ranchers. This epidemic of farm liquidations has seriously depressed prices for farmland, livestock, and machinery, causing a serious threat to our rural banking system. In 1986, there were more farm bank failures than at any time since the Great Depression. With farmers going broke, many rural communities are becoming ghost towns as small businesses, churches, and schools begin to close. Every farm liquidated eliminates 3 to 5 farm-related jobs, adding to our unemployment, reducing tax revenues, and making our budget deficits even worse. As family farmers are wiped out, corporations and speculators are taking over. Already they control 27% of our food-producing resources. Unless we act now to reverse this trend, outside investors could take control of over $500 billion in food-producing resources, resulting in more expensive, less nutritious, and less reliable food. Corporate farms put short-term profits ahead of soil conservation or protecting the safety of our drinking water. It is not only our own country that is affected by this crisis. We are also exporting our troubles around the world. Subsidized U.S. exports dumped onto world markets make it impossible for many third world farmers to compete against imports in their local markets. Without a market, these farmers are being driven off their land and forced into urban slums or shanty towns. The abandoned land eventually erodes or turns into desert. The end result is growing dependence on food imports for countries who can afford it, and famine for those who can't. Farmers today are in the midst of a crisis quite similar to the one faced by our parents and grandparents in the 1930s. And just like in the 30s, people everywhere are organizing to meet this challenge. Rallies and protests are being held. Farmers, townspeople, and urban supporters are lobbying Congress for fair prices, debt relief, and emergency assistance. In 1985, Congress debated federal farm legislation. 2 sharply different alternatives were considered. The first, often referred to as the market clearing or marketing loan approach, favored lowering farm prices dramatically in hopes of gaining larger overseas markets. Under these proposals, taxpayer costs would increase and supply management efforts would be discontinued. Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole led the fight for this approach for President Reagan. The second, often referred to as the producer referendum or supply management approach, would raise farm prices to cover actual costs of production and establish effective supply management. Deficiency payment subsidies would be eliminated, and strong soil and water conservation provisions would be included. Senator Tom Harkin led the fight for higher prices and supply management. The Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute at the University of Missouri and Iowa State University was contracted by the federal government to analyze Farm Bill proposals. The following comparisons between the market clearing and supply management proposals are taken directly from the FAPRI report. It was projected that prices for all major commodities would fall dramatically under market clearing proposals. The supply management proposals would set prices for these same commodities at levels near the average cost of production. They projected that taxpayer costs for deficiency payment subsidies under market clearing proposals would be between 12 and 20 billion. Supply management proposals would totally eliminate deficiency payment subsidies, costing around 1 billion to administer. It was projected that exports would decline under market clearing proposals. Cutting farm prices by 25% could only generate an additional 13% in volume, resulting in a net reduction of earnings. Under supply management proposals, volume would decline slightly, but the higher prices would generate around 30% more export earnings. Although the FAPRI report clearly highlighted the shortcomings of the market clearing proposal, Congress was heavily lobbied to ignore the warning. After the defeat of several supply management proposals, President Reagan's market clearing proposal passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law right before Christmas of 1985. As predicted, Reagan's Farm Bill has driven farm prices to record low levels. Wheat has dropped from $3.30 in 1985 to under $2.50. Corn has fallen from $2.50 to $1.25. This farm bill has also been the most expensive in U.S. history. Federal farm subsidies ended up costing nearly $26 billion last year, an amount more than twice the 1986 Gramm-Rudman cuts. And, as predicted, the lower prices set by the 1985 Farm Bill resulted in an actual decline in U.S. export earnings. And, as predicted, the lower prices set by the 1985 Farm Bill resulted in an actual decline in U.S. export earnings. Our new lower prices have failed to significantly boost the volume of our exports. This is primarily because the U.S. dominates world food trade. Whatever price we set determines the world market price. This means that other major exporting countries also drop their prices in order to continue competing with U.S. prices. Many third world countries export crops to earn money needed to service their debt. As the U.S. lowers world prices, it forces these countries to actually increase their production and exports just to maintain their same cash flows. This will eventually cause an actual reduction in the number of bushels that can be sold by the United States. What is worse is that this ill-conceived export-oriented farm policy required subsidy payments for corn of over $6 billion, but resulted in corn export sales of only $2.5 billion. Subsidies of $3.5 billion resulted in total wheat exports of only $2.7 billion. Dissatisfaction with his irrational and destructive farm policy is sweeping the countryside and main streets of rural America. In the recent National Wheat Referendum survey, wheat producers strongly supported supply management and higher prices, in spite of a negative campaign costing millions of dollars waged by the grain corporations and their allies in the National Fertilizer Institute and the American Farm Bureau. A League of Rural Voters national opinion poll found the same support among all producers, with supply management and higher prices preferred by a 2-to-1 margin. In September of 1986, over 2,000 producers gathered at the United Farmer and Rancher Congress in St. Louis to speak out against the current farm program, strongly endorsing supply management and higher prices. In the November elections, over 25,000 farmers participated in a Farm Vote 86 Get Out the Vote campaign, turning many races into referendums on Reagan's farm policy. Incumbent farm state senators who opposed supply management were thrown out, and many other local and state elections were decided on the farm policy debate. Over 150 farm, church, labor, and civil rights organizations have formed a national Save the Family Farm coalition to fight for fair prices, debt relief, and emergency assistance. They are working closely with other farm organizations to win passage of new supply management legislation, the Save the Family Farm Act. The bill would eliminate all deficiency payment subsidies, raise farm prices in the marketplace, and give producers the right to vote in a referendum on supply management provisions. All major crops and dairy are included. Other important provisions include protection of our export market share through a bonus bushel program, assistance to hard-hit livestock producers, and strong environmental protection provisions. The Save the Family Farm Act also contains a major debt relief section that helps both farmers and lenders avoid foreclosure and bankruptcy by fostering debt restructuring agreements. These agreements would be achieved by bringing farmers and lenders together through mediation programs administered at the state level. To make the agreements possible, the federal government will offer zero-interest emergency loans, the amount of which will be based on the financial circumstances of each family farmer. Texas A&M has completed a study of the Harkin bill and other alternatives. They concluded that in all major areas, the Harkin bill was the best alternative. Let's look at three comparisons. By eliminating all deficiency payment subsidies, the Harkin bill dramatically reduces taxpayer costs. Under the Harkin bill, net farm income would be significantly higher, greatly increasing the probability of survival for farmers. Paying farmers a fair price would result in a one-time increase in consumer food prices of only 3 to 5%, less than a nickel on a loaf of bread. American consumers currently spend 13% of their disposable income for food, the lowest anywhere in the world. To ensure that these small price increases would not hurt the poor, the Save the Family Farm Act reallocates a portion of the $20 billion saved by eliminating subsidies to dramatically expand our nation's food assistance programs, which have been hit by devastating cuts over the last 6 years. The giant food corporations have lobbied Congress for extremely low farm prices and high government subsidies in order to increase profits at taxpayer expense. In a letter to Congress, the AFL-CIO criticized this approach. In urging your support for the Harkin Farm Bill, the AFL-CIO is aware of opponents' arguments that this program would result in higher prices and is therefore anti-consumer. While always concerned about the interests of consumers, millions of whom are union members, the AFL-CIO has painfully experienced the toll that an obsession for the lowest price can have on American industry and, in turn, the jobs of thousands of America's workers. It was clear to the AFL-CIO that low farm prices have not meant low food prices. This chart shows consumer food prices keeping pace with the costs of farming at the same time that farm prices have fallen. The Save the Family Farm Act is a good bill for farmers, taxpayers, consumers, and the environment. It is strongly opposed by the grain corporations. Cargill has pulled together other agribusiness corporations and hired former Deputy Ag Secretary Bill Lesher to lobby Congress for even lower farm prices. Supporting the farmers are literally hundreds of local, state, and national organizations, ranging from endorsements by the National Council of Churches to the National Conference of Black Mayors. Environmental and anti-hunger groups are lending their support as well. Evidence of even broader support for farmers was provided by a recent national poll in which 78% said they believed corporate control over our food system would mean dramatic increases in consumer food prices. People working together can and will solve this crisis. Everyone can help pass this legislation. here's what you can do. Urge your congressmen and senators to endorse and co-sponsor the Save the Family Farm Act. Show this slideshow at your church, school, or civic group and get their endorsement. Provide financial support to groups working to pass this legislation. Working together, we can keep our family farmers on their land, and we can save our rural churches, businesses, and communities. We can keep our food system out of the hands of the corporations. Land and water resources for our children and future generations.
It ain't all just for nothing that they've stayed around. It ain't all just for nothing, no, they didn't move to town. It ain't all just for nothing, don't let them farmers down. It ain't all just for nothing, let them know. Let them know, let them know. Let them farmers know. It ain't all just for nothing, let them know.